Summer 1945. The war in the Pacific was a furnace that refused to die down. For years, the jungles of the Philippines had been battlegrounds, lush green landscapes turned into fields of despair. But as the conflict neared its end, the air changed. Gunfire thinned, silence grew heavy, and soldiers, American and Japanese alike, began to look less like enemies and more like survivors of the same storm. On one humid afternoon, a group of wounded Japanese soldiers was discovered on the outskirts of a small Philippine village, lying half-conscious among the roots of a fallen banyan tree. Their uniforms were torn, their faces grey with exhaustion. The battle had passed days earlier, leaving them stranded, bleeding, starving, waiting for whatever came next. They expected execution. Every rumor, every scrap of propaganda had told them that capture meant torture, that Americans showed no mercy. So when the sound of boots approached through the brush, they gripped their rifles with trembling hands, ready to die on their feet. But the voices that followed weren't shouting. They were calm, measured. American soldiers calling out in English and broken Japanese, "Put down your weapons, we'll help you." Among them was Corporal Daniel Avery, a field medic from Kansas who had seen enough blood to last a lifetime. He spotted the group, raised a hand to his squad. "Easy, boys, no sudden moves." The Japanese lieutenant, a young man barely 30, stared in disbelief as the Americans knelt beside them instead of firing. Avery's canteen opened, water poured, a rough cloth pressed to a wound. The lieutenant whispered in shock, "Why, you help?" Avery looked at him, sweat running down his neck. "Because you're bleeding. That's all that matters." They carried the wounded to a makeshift field hospital, an old church whose walls still bore the scars of shell fire. Inside, the smell of antiseptic foam aught with the scent of smoke and rain. The American medics moved with quiet precision. Bandages unrolled, morphine needles hissed, hands worked in silence. Avery guided his team like clockwork, calling for supplies, checking pulses, writing notes on worn scraps of paper. The Japanese soldiers lay still, too stunned to resist. One of them, a boy no older than 19, flinched when Avery knelt beside him. "Easy," Avery murmured. "You're safe now." The boy's eyes filled with confusion, and something dangerously close to relief. Nearby, Lieutenant Grace McAllister, the head nurse, directed orderlies with crisp authority. Her voice carried the firmness of command, but her hands were gentle. She noticed Avery watching her work and said quietly, "They don't believe we're really helping them." He nodded. "Would you, if you'd been told mercy was a trick?" Grace glanced at the line of cots. "Then we'll have to make them believe it's real." For the next several days, the wounded men were tended alongside American soldiers. The camp doctors drew no distinction. Blood was blood, and pain was universal. But disbelief lingered. Whenever an American medic entered the ward, the Japanese men would stiffen. Some covered their faces, others muttered prayers under their breath. One evening, as the rain hammered the tin roof, Avery sat beside the Japanese lieutenant, the same man he'd found beneath the banyan tree. The officer's arm was bound in clean gauze now, his fever subsiding. Through the interpreter, Avery asked, "What's your name?" The reply came hesitantly. "Lieutenant Kenji Takahiro, Imperial Army." Avery nodded. "Daniel Avery, U.S. Army Medical Corps." Takahiro studied him carefully, as if expecting the name to come with mockery or malice, but Avery only checked his pulse, then smiled faintly. "You'll live. That's good news, right?" Kenji's brow furrowed. "Why, you save me?" Avery leaned back, exhaustion in his eyes. "Because if I don't, the war wins twice." Kenji stared at him, confused. Avery continued softly. "Once when we fight, and again when we forget we're human." The next morning, Kenji woke to find Grace placing a fresh bandage on his arm. She worked quietly, humming under her breath, a tune unfamiliar to him, but gentle all the same. When she finished, he whispered, "You are not afraid. Of enemy?" She smiled. "Not of a man who says thank you." Kenji said nothing more, but when she left, he turned toward the open window, watching the sunlight spill through the clouds. For the first time in months, it didn't feel like the light was judging him. Outside the church, the jungle buzzed with life again. Avery sat on the steps, wiping his hands clean, when a young American private approached. "Sir," the soldier said, "some of the guys aren't too happy about this. Patching up the enemy, feeding 'em our rations." Avery didn't look up. "They're not the enemy anymore." The private hesitated. "You sure about that?" Avery finally met his eyes. "If we forget how to care for a man just because he wore a different uniform, then what exactly did we fight for?" The private said nothing. He just nodded slowly, a lesson landing somewhere dull. That night, a storm rolled in. The roof leaked, the candles flickered. The patients, American and Japanese alike, lay side by side, divided only by the aisle, but united by exhaustion. Kenji couldn't sleep. He listened to the rain and the steady rhythm of boots pacing outside. Then he saw Avery moving quietly between the beds, checking vitals, adjusting blankets. He watched the American kneel beside a feverish Japanese boy, cooling his forehead with a damp cloth. The boy mumbled something, words of apology, perhaps, or confusion, and Avery just whispered, "Rest. It's over now." Kenji turned his face away, ashamed of the lump in his throat. Days passed. The line between patient and prisoner blurred. When the time came for the Japanese soldiers to be transferred to a larger camp, many of them hesitated. They didn't want to leave the field hospital, the strange place where mercy had lived. As the convoy trucks rumbled in, Avery moved down the line of men, shaking hands, offering water for the road. When he reached Kenji, the lieutenant stood, bowing low. In broken English, he said, "You heal my body, but more, you heal something I did not know was broken." Avery's reply was simple. "Then it was worth it." The two men exchanged a long, wordless look. In that moment, there was no victor, no vanquished, just two soldiers who had seen too much and still managed to find something good in it. That night, after the trucks were gone, Grace found Avery sitting alone outside the church. "You think they'll remember this?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "If they do, maybe it'll save someone else one day." The jungle sang around them. Insects buzzed, leaves whispered, and far in the distance, thunder rolled like an echo of a war that had finally begun to fade. Grace looked toward the horizon. "Funny, isn't it? All the things we were told about them, and all the things they were told about us." Avery nodded. "Turns out the truth's quieter. It doesn't shout, it heals." The convoy reached the American field base 2 days later. Rows of white tents stretched across the clearing like ghosts of the battles that had ended. Beyond them stood a large Red Cross banner swaying in the damp wind, the symbol that meant life to anyone who dared believe in it. Lieutenant Kenji Takahiro stepped off the truck carefully, his arm still bound in the same clean gauze Corporal Daniel Avery had wrapped. The wound was healing, but what felt stranger was the quiet inside him. No orders barked, no hatred humming in his chest, just the uneasy calm of a man who had outlived every certainty. A U.S. Army nurse greeted the arrivals. "You'll be taken to Ward C," she said through the interpreter. "You'll get food, water, rest, then processing." Kenji bowed stiffly. He could not make himself say thank you, but the word hovered unspoken in the air. Avery watched from the ramp. The two men exchanged a nod, brief, formal, but alive with the weight of all that had passed between them. Inside Ward C, sunlight spilled through open flaps, catching the pale sheen of steel trays and white sheets. The Americans moved with quiet efficiency, the rhythm of care replacing the rhythm of war. One corner of the ward held half a dozen Japanese soldiers, thin, pale, uncertain. Among them, Kenji quickly became the interpreter, the one who could bridge words, if not yet trust. When Grace McAllister entered with her clipboard, she paused. "You speak some English?" "A little," Kenji answered. "Good. Tell your men we'll be checking their wounds again after lunch. They can rest or read if they like." "Read?" Kenji echoed, startled. Grace smiled. "Books, magazines, a few in Japanese." That afternoon she returned with a small stack. Tattered paperbacks, war-torn translations of Dickens and Tolstoy donated by the Red Cross. When she placed one in Kenji's hands, he turned the pages as though touching something forbidden. He read until nightfall. When Avery passed by, he saw the Japanese officer tracing a line of text with his finger and whispering the words as if learning to breathe again. A week passed. The hospital began to feel less like captivity and more like strange diplomacy. Americans taught the Japanese how to use the new crutches and splints. The Japanese, in turn, helped repair torn netting, tended the vegetable patch behind the tents. Every evening the air filled with the smell of boiled rice and canned meat, the laughter of nurses who were too tired to keep their hearts guarded. One evening, Grace approached Avery outside the mess tent. "You know," she said, "I used to think healing was just medicine. Now it feels like translation. One kindness at a time." He smiled. "You sound like a chaplain." She shrugged. "Maybe we all become one after enough wounds." Inside the ward, Kenji was writing. Paper had been scarce in the jungle, but here the Americans gave it freely, along with pencils, envelopes, and the quiet luxury of time. His first letter home began stiffly. "My dear brother, I am alive. The enemy you warned me about gave me water, food, and care. They spoke kindly. They do not mock us. I do not understand it, but I will not forget it." He hesitated, staring at the unfinished line. Then he added, "Perhaps mercy is the last weapon left in the world." He folded the paper, sealing it with trembling hands. 2 weeks later, a truck arrived carrying new patients, Americans this time, gaunt from malaria and months of combat. Space grew tight, and the line between nationalities vanished entirely. Kenji found himself lifting a stretcher beside an American orderly, their movements perfectly synchronized, though neither spoke the other's tongue. When the stretcher was set down, the orderly grinned. "Good job, Lieutenant." Kenji blinked, realizing the man had used his title, not enemy, not prisoner. Lieutenant. That night he lay awake, staring at the canvas ceiling, wondering how enemies could start to resemble mirrors. By August, the war was ending. Rumors rippled through the camp like wind. Surrender papers signed, cities gone silent. The Americans didn't cheer. They just worked more quietly, as though unsure what victory was supposed to feel like. On the day the radio confirmed Japan's surrender, the entire hospital froze. The Japanese patients sat in stunned silence. Some wept softly. Others stared at the floor, faces unreadable. Avery entered the ward slowly. He didn't offer speeches or pity, just stood among them, hat in hand. "I don't know what this means for you," he said, his voice low, "but I hope it means no one else has to bleed." Through the interpreter the words reached Kenji. He bowed his head. "It means we can start being men again." That evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, the Americans held a small service outside the tents. No flags, no anthems, only a prayer for the dead offered for both sides. Ace read from a worn Bible, her voice trembling slightly. "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." When she finished, silence settled over the field. Then, from somewhere behind the rows of patients, a Japanese voice began to hum a hymn, soft, hesitant. Another joined, and until the air itself seemed to breathe with forgiveness. Avery closed his eyes. For the first time since arriving in the Pacific, he believed the war had truly ended. In the weeks that followed, the wounded began to leave. Transports carried men back to their islands, their families, their lives that had paused in blood and fear. Before Kenji's turn came, he sought out Avery and Grace. They were cleaning out the supply tent when he approached, standing awkwardly with a small parcel in his hands. "For you," he said, bowing. Inside the wrapping lay a tiny wooden box carved from a scrap of the banyan tree they had found him under. Etched on its lid were 2 words, in English, carefully spelled, "Thank you." Grace pressed a hand to her mouth. "It's beautiful." Avery looked at him, eyes wet. "You didn't have to." Kenji smiled faintly. "Yes, I did, because you did not have to save us either." They shook hands, soldiers no longer, only human beings who had shared the same light. When Kenji boarded the ship that would take him home, he looked back toward the field hospital one last time. The Red Cross banner fluttered in the wind, bright against the setting sun. He whispered a quiet prayer that mercy would not end with the voyage. A month later, a letter arrived at the Avery family farm in Kansas. It bore a Japanese postmark and careful English script. "Dear Corporal Avery, I am home. My arm is strong again. I tend a small clinic for wounded villagers. When I bind their injuries, I remember how you worked in silence, never asking who was friend or foe. You Tao taught me that healing is the truest victory. May peace find you always. Kenji Takahiro." Avery read the letter twice, then tucked it into his Bible beside a faded photograph of his unit. Outside, the Kansas wind bent the wheat like waves, and he thought, maybe the world really is learning to breathe again. Autumn 1948. 3 years had passed since the surrender, yet the Pacific still echoed with the ghosts of the war. Cities rebuilt in fragments, letters traveled slower than forgiveness. In a small clinic on the outskirts of Hiroshima, Dr. Kenji Takahiro set a child's broken arm and tied the bandage with the same steady hands that had once trembled beneath a banyan tree. On the wall above his desk hung a faded Red Cross flag, patched, sun-bleached, precious. To his patients he was simply Sensei Kenji, the quiet doctor who never turned anyone away, not even those who could pay only in gratitude. But late at night, when the lamps burned low, he still saw the faces of the men who had saved him, Corporal Avery and Nurse Grace McAllister, moving through his memory with the calm of angels. He kept their photograph in his drawer, taken by an army photographer the day he left the camp, a line of medics standing in front of the field hospital, smiling in exhaustion. The caption on the back read, "Ward C, 1945. Mercy under fire." Half a world away in Kansas, Daniel Avery ran a modest community clinic. His hands were slower now, his hair touched with grey, but the same patience lived in his voice. Patients said he treated everyone the same, the farmer, the drifter, the child with dirt on his knees. He never spoke much about the war, except to the young volunteers who asked why he kept that small wooden box on his desk. He'd tap its lid and say, "Because a man I once called the enemy taught me what winning really means." Inside the box lay nothing but air and memory, the space mercy had once filled. In 1952, a letter arrived bearing foreign stamps. "Dear Dr. Avery, it has been many years. I have opened a small hospital. We treat farmers, mothers, children, anyone who needs healing. When we run out of supplies, I remember your calm and your hands. The men you saved are fathers now. Their children will never see war if we do our work well. If you ever return to Japan, our doors are open to you. Kenji Takahiro." Avery folded the letter carefully. That night he told his wife, "Imagine that. A man who once thought I'd shoot him now runs a hospital that saves our kind of boys." She smiled. "Maybe you didn't just patch him up. Maybe you rewired the world a little." A decade later, history caught up with them. In 1962, the Red Cross organized a reunion of former field medics and international doctors in Tokyo. Avery hesitated before accepting. Travel felt extravagant for a country doctor. But when the invitation mentioned Ward C veterans' welcome, something in him stirred. He arrived in autumn, stepping into a city reborn, bright, humming, clean. Gone were the ruins and the smoke. In their place rose glass towers and laughter. At the welcome hall, banners in both languages read, "From battlefields to hospitals, 17 years of peace." Avery scanned the crowd until a familiar figure approached, older, leaner, wearing a white doctor's coat. "Corporal Avery?" Avery turned. "Lieutenant Takahiro?" The two men stared for a heartbeat, then laughed. That incredulous laughter of men who'd both survived more than they can explain. They clasped hands firmly. "I told you we'd meet again," Avery said. "And you kept your promise," Kenji replied. That evening they walked the city together, past neon signs and quiet shrines, speaking not as veterans but as healers comparing notes. Kenji showed him photographs of the children his clinic had saved. Avery listened, eyes bright. "Every one of them is an answer to the war," he said. Before they parted, Kenji handed him a small gift, a polished steel stethoscope engraved with 2 words, "Mercy Lives." "Now it belongs to both of us," he said. Years melted into decades. Avery retired. Kenji's clinic became a hospital. Letters crossed the ocean less frequently, but never stopped. When Kenji's son became a doctor, he sent a photograph of his graduation, "For the American who healed my father, from the son who heals in his name." Avery framed it beside the wooden box. In 1975, news came that Daniel Avery had passed peacefully in his sleep. The local paper ran a short obituary. WWII medic devoted his life to peace. A week later, Kenji received the clipping in the mail, forwarded by Avery's wife with a handwritten note. "He often spoke of you. He said the world felt smaller and kinder because of one day in a field hospital." Kenji placed the letter in the chapel of his hospital and lit a candle. "Thank you, Daniel," he whispered. "We kept your promise." Spring 1985. A new generation of students visited the Hiroshima Peace Museum. Among the exhibits was a simple display: a Red Cross flag, a wooden box, and 2 photographs, one of a Kansas medic, one of a Japanese doctor. A plaque read, "Their meeting turned enemies into healers. Their mercy became medicine for the world." An elderly man in a white coat stood quietly before the case, hands folded. It was Kenji. A young visitor approached. "Sensei, were they real?" Kenji smiled. "Yes, and so is what they taught us, that kindness survives everything." He looked at the flag one last time, its edges soft with age. Then he turned and walked into the spring sunlight, the sound of children laughing outside carrying further than the echoes of any gun ever had. If this story reminded you that compassion is stronger than war, subscribe for daily cinematic history stories, true moments of mercy, courage, and humanity that still inspire the world.